Ted, welcome to the show.
Hey, Caleb, it's definitely a pleasure to be here with you.
It is a pleasure having you on, and you are one of the few people that I had on a list from the very beginning that I was like, if I could interview the father of the 401k, it would be a true honor. And I have to say, I spent the last 2 days really watching a lot of your interviews. I read your latest book. I took copious notes. For people that know me, I'm not a reader, but I read your book. And what I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to create a platform and a conversation that helps open people's eyes. And what I really think would be great is to, number one, give them the history, because your book is like 70% history, your story, and you do that for a reason. You want to give people context. And I think you've been taken out of context on a couple of interviews. And part of the way that we can avoid being taken out of context is to give people context of you and your story. You've spent over 60 years of your life fighting for the people, wanting to do the right thing, and being in the industry less than 6 years, let's just put it that way. I thank you for the work that you've done. And then I have a lot of specific questions and thoughts, but I really appreciate you being on here. And I'm wondering if you would open up and share with people your story. And I know that you got married young. You better believe I'm going to ask some marriage advice at the end of the show. But I know you got married young, and I know that you grew up in the Philadelphia area. But for the typical person that may have just knows you as the father of the 401k, how can we give them some context of 60 plus years in this industry?
Okay, actually, I'm going to correct you on one point. I grew up on a dairy farm in South Central PA,
Okay.
and the reason we were in Philadelphia for 37 years in that area was because we got married so young, we ran away. And we knew our parents weren't going to warmly embrace our endeavor, Caleb, so we took off to Philadelphia. And yeah, I'd never been in Philly, neither one of us. I mean, in a big city of that type. And so, any event, how my career started was I answered an ad that was in the newspaper for a math clerk. And math was my major and my strong suit. And so I answered the ad, and it happened to be in the home office of an insurance company in their pension department. So that was where I started in the retirement business, Caleb, and it was actually working with defined benefit plans. You know, I was an actuarial grunt. And after 5.5 years there, I was getting offers, to go to different places and get out of that environment. And so I ended up joining two guys who were primarily in the insurance business as their primary focus, and they wanted to build retirement side of the business. And so with them, I started a benefit consulting company. It was actually Johnson Benna Company, and from scratch, built the consulting company. We sold that in 1990. We built it to about 250 employees, about a $25 million business in 1990, and sold it, and I was locked into a 3-year contract. Once that was over, I was out on my own, and have been on my own ever since that.
Very cool. And I know that you've definitely been associated with potentially being responsible for blowing up a lot of the pension plans and all this stuff. But in your book, you write quite a bit about how before the 401k happened, what did most companies do for their employees? And what some people think is that this was a perfect pension plan. Everyone got pensions, everyone was taken care of. And I think in your book, you'd give a pretty good argument that it's like, okay, pensions may have been good for some people, but it wasn't what everyone thinks of it. So when you were in, working with your company before it was sold, what were you doing before the 401k was happening? And I also know that you said in your book that ERISA, it kind of hurt your guys' ability to even do your job. So can you give the listener like what was retirement and retirement planning like before the 401k?
Yeah, hasn't happened during this presidential election, Caleb, but during the last one, um, there was mention by our president and one of the the candidates running, that we need to get back to the old days, when everybody got a pension and just walked away at retirement, and they lived well. They got a fixed income for life. And there are a number of things wrong with that perception. The first is the fact that there was never more than 30% of the private workforce who were covered under an employer pension plan, no more than 30%. And they were mostly, the big companies. And the one other thing is, hey, the insurance company I worked for had a pension. And in order to get a benefit, you had to stay until you're age 60. I mean, I had to stay for 40 years, 42 years. If I left before that, I lost it all. And, that was typical in that time. Okay. That was lock-in, the golden handcuffs they referred to. And then another big problem is that companies that had plans that were underfunded, when they went out of business, retirees and workers lost a large percent of their pension benefit, or most of it. And so those were reasons why we got what you referred to as ERISA, that was enacted in 1974. It was badly needed. It overhauled the system, and it put in place additional layer of financial security called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. And what happens is that is a place where, when companies terminate and have underfunded plans, some of those benefits may be provided by that quasi-government entity. But what happened when that was put in place, without getting deeply involved in it, the way it was structured made it impossible to sell new pension plans to employers that didn't have them. That's what I was involved in doing. I sold pension plans. And what happened after ERISA was companies couldn't cleanly walk away from them, when they went out of business. And so as a result of that, it became impossible, to sell those plans. And that started the demise, actually, of the private pension system. And take it a little bit longer here, I had the opportunity on the 20th anniversary of ERISA to participate in a major celebration in Washington. And I was given the responsibility of defending defined contribution plans against defined benefit plans. And, it was a point counterpoint type of setup. And, I mentioned in my opening remarks that I didn't get into that debate because, both plans had their positives and negatives. It wasn't that, one was perfect and the other one wasn't. But I also mentioned at that celebration that when historians look back on the demise of the private pension system, that ERISA that we were there celebrating would be one of the primary reasons. And, the two congressmen who were the primary backers of that program, and they're in the audience participating in the celebration, probably didn't like hearing what I had to say. And Caleb, if there was a 30th anniversary celebration, I didn't get invited back.
You probably could hear a pin drop as they're like, "What did we do putting him on stage?" So I want to clarify. So that they brought in extra regulation because it was needed. There's problems, but the problem is with that regulation, there's no company that wanted to take on that a plan after that, because then they were taking on too much risk. Is that kind of a fair?
Yeah, I can give you a specific example, Caleb. I had one of the first plans that went through Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. It was a small business, absentee owner, women in low-level minimum wage type environment production. And the president came to me and said, look, some of these ladies have been here for 20, 30 years, and, I'd like them to get something when they retire. And so I helped him design and set up a plan that he was able to sell the owner into doing. And one of the reasons the owner would agree to it is the fact that in that time, if a company like that set up a plan in good faith and they terminated it, there was no liability tail to it. They simply had to use what assets were in the plan to provide whatever benefits could be provided. And in this particular instance, within probably about 3 years after they set it up, the company was on the ropes, going out of business. And in the meantime, ERISA had been enacted. And now this company had to negotiate with PBGC because PBGC could claim a portion of their assets. And, the president was irate. I mean, obviously, the owner wasn't happy. The president was irate. The government changed the rules on this thing, and they had no way of being able to work around that. And once those type of stories began to get published, accountants would tell their clients, hey, look, you don't want a pension plan. Stay away from these things.
So what I want to do is I want to move forward. So after that happened, there was a gap before you discovered the 401k. What you did something like key off plans, and I'm wondering if you can explain like where your mindset was at, because essentially that regulation, while it may have been needed, kind of put you out of business unless you innovated. So what did you do until you discovered this little known secret in the tax code that was put in?
Yeah, well, I made my first discovery, digging into the laws regarding retirement plans to find out, hey, I had an opportunity to do something that wasn't being done. And this involved what were known as KEO KEO plans. They were plans for self-employed individuals, Caleb. And at the time, everybody thought they had to be set up with insurance companies. That was the only way to do it. And so I realized there was another opportunity, and so started consulting to professional organizations, doctors, accountants, and attorneys, that there are ways to set these up actually where they could have self-controlled investments, where they can invest the money anywhere they wanted to. And so, that was how I ended up getting initially involved with defined contribution plans. It was by necessity and finding, that opportunity is a way to do it.
So what I want to do now is like you are very much known as the person that, I mean, you're called the father of the 401k. And you, it's not like you came up with the tax code, but you discovered it and then you got IRS to give the thumbs up. Can you walk me through that story? Because you wrote about it in your book, but I really want people to have context of like this didn't happen overnight. And you were very excited as you went through this journey. And I can very much relate to, as I'm learning about money, just going back to some of the excitement that I've had. So walk us through that.
Yeah. Well, what happened here was there was a type of profit sharing plan existing called cash deferred plans, and they were primarily set up by banks. And the reason banks were setting them up was twofold. One was they realized that they weren't getting much mileage from lower paid employees by having these plans in place, and the other one was the senior executives that were getting cash bonuses. Um, we had 70% marginal tax bracket, so you got $10,000 contribution, or I'm sorry, you got a bonus of $10,000. 7,000 of it was going to taxes. So they developed what was called a cash deferred profit sharing plan. And this was an instance where IRS allowed these to happen, Treasury, but there wasn't anything, and you couldn't go and find any law, Caleb, that said, hey, here's how you can do this type of plan. And the way they worked was the cash bonus that you were getting got eliminated, and it went into this type of plan. And half of it had to be deferred for retirement. The other half could be taken as cash. So what happened when ERISA was passed in pre-ERISA was 1972, Treasury put out a notice and said, hey, we aren't happy about these plans because the higher paid are deferring and getting a big tax break. The lower paid are virtually all taking half as cash. So that came out in 72. And 74, Congress put a provision in ERISA that said, hey, Treasury, keep your hands off. We're going to decide the future of these plans, but they weren't ready to do that. So that was in 74. 1978, one of these end of the year tax bills where, things get thrown in order to get votes. Section K was added under 401 of the IRS code. And Caleb, it was a page and a half long. That's all it was. Okay. Uh, and it wasn't expected, of course, to be a big thing. It was, expected to be very limited. In fact, the lost revenue impact was, maybe $100 million or so, And so what it did, it created a framework for the future operation of these employer-funded cash deferred plans. So that was 78. That provision became effective in January of 1980. And, I've been quoted supposedly saying I discovered a hidden paragraph. Well, this wasn't hidden. I knew it was passed in 78, and anybody, familiar with these plans knew it as well. But January of 1980 came, nobody was running around selling 401k plans. And so what happened in the fall of 78, I was redesigning a retirement program for a bank and was drawn back to this section knowing that, okay, now we have a framework for how this might work. And I was working through that. There are two key aspects that came to mind. One was the fact in order to make these work, you had to get broad participation for the lower 2/3 paid employees. Otherwise, they wouldn't work. And so I realized that if the only benefit a teller would get from giving up maybe a $500 bonus, was maybe a $50 or $75 tax break, probably wasn't enough. So what I came up with was the idea of, well, um, let's increase the ante. Let's add a matching employer contribution that says, well, if you're willing to defer this for retirement, you'll get a tax break, but you'll also get additional money via a match, from the bank. So that was the first concept of utilizing this section of the code, for an employer match type of plan, with then the next step taking it to linking employee contributions. And, the employee contributions to 401k, Caleb, are actually a salary reduction. When you sign to participate in a 401k, you're authorizing your employer to reduce your salary. So those were the two things I brought to this, which is made it turn into what it is. And the key here is neither one of those provisions were in the law. There wasn't anything there saying that you could do either one of them, but there wasn't anything saying thou shalt not. I know the holy book, right? The shall nots.
That's right.
Yeah, there
That's
wasn't
right.
any
Well,
shall not.
and you wrote in your book that you were challenged. There's tax attorneys that were like, I don't know if I feel comfortable about that. And so what you're saying is this got thrown in to a bill, and the purpose potentially was just for high executives to be able to defer more of their money and save more money on taxes. And you saw that and you were like, wait, this would be really powerful if more people could participate. And one of the best ways for them to participate, because if you're not making a ton of money, the tax benefit is less than if you're making a lot of money. But you're saying the match was that carrot that would get more participation. And what was the tax rate in 1980?
Well, the marginal rate was, in the 75% range,
So
at the top.
yeah, which is definitely a bummer. Let's just put it that way. So is that kind of like accurate as you like that's what you saw, and then you obviously then sent that to the IRS to see if you could get the thumbs up because you didn't want to set up plans and get your hand slapped.
Well, my senior partner, Ed Johnson, was concerned about that, once it started to get out there, it could get shot down, and that was a valid concern. So we were fortunate that, Ronald Reagan got elected, and when he formed his cabinet, one of our clients became the transportation secretary, and he was a sharp business guy, and we were able to go down, meet with him on this. And his question was, what do you guys want? And we said, well, introduce us to Reagan over in Treasury. And, that hooked me up with the guy who was actually writing the regulations. And, the 401k regulations were what was going to be key, because since this legislation was only a page and a half long, the guts of it was going to be determined by the IRS regulations. And so I had the opportunity to chat with him and familiarize him with what we were doing. And he didn't give me any insight into what was going to happen, but um, as comfortable the match was going to be, all right. The big thing was employee salary reduction, and I was able to explain to him how if they didn't allow that, IRS was going to have a really difficult time, uh, you know, administering this section of the law, because if he didn't allow, we could work it around it anyhow. And Caleb, there's another important part of this story as well, and that is the fact, when we think about what happens politically, Ronald Reagan, one of his key platform in terms of domestically when he got elected, was to increase capital formation. And the way he proposed doing that was making IRAs available to everyone. At the time, IRAs were only available if you weren't covered by a plan. And the spearheader of that was Jack Kemp, from Buffalo. And so I had the opportunity to meet with Senator Kemp, and I told him two things. I said, hey, the first one is the fact that uh, there's this thing you guys don't have your eye on called 401k. It's going to be costing you millions of dollars of tax revenue within a few years. Take that into account in your planning here. And the other one is I told him, hey, there's no reason you need to expand the IRAs because this is a heck of a lot better. Well, that input got ignored, and they went down that track, and we ran off with 401k. Later on, to have President Reagan come back and try and kill this thing when he was, doing his Tax Reform Act. So pretty bizarre times.
They wanted to kill it because a loss of revenue that they were experiencing because so many people are taking advantage of this.
Yeah, what we were caught with at that time was the fact that the president was hell bent on not having tax increases, ratcheting up military spending. We had the Democratic Congress that wouldn't budge on reducing entitlements and so forth. So we got gridlocked into what became known as revenue enhancers. And they were backdoor ways of getting additional tax revenue without being identified as a tax increase. And that was the driver here of going after and trying to kill 401k, which was a backdoor way of getting additional tax revenue. And the only way it got preserved was by many participants at that time writing in saying, hey, what in the world are you doing? This is the only way we have to save for retirement. And, I'll mention, I had thought about it when you were talking later on, most important thing to me about 401k, Caleb, is it's really not a program that does much for, the top wage earners, 150, 200,000 and up. It's really a fantastic benefit for middle income America, those in the 20 to 150 compensation range. And, that's been a real blessing to me, to see that group get this kind of help. And, the biggest benefit I've learned of 401k over the years is it converts spenders into savers by making saving the first priority. Yeah. And I've had many young individuals, who've accumulated $10,000, $15,000 in these plans after a few years to say, wow, I'd have never done this otherwise. If it didn't come first out of my paycheck, it would never happened.
The richest man in Babylon, pay yourself first. The 401k is one of those systems that can automate your ability to invest money. And a lot of times, and because I see a lot of people that near retirement, whether it's the right thing or wrong thing, the reality is their 401k, other than their home, is usually by far their biggest asset. And as you and I both know, the savings rate, and we just have a savings crisis, quite frankly, in our country and in the world. And so it's pretty crazy. And you've said multiple times in your book, and I want to get to some hard questions with the 401k, but like you said multiple times in your book that the 401k is responsible for over $10 trillion of accumulated money, whether it's rolled over or saved. And for that, you can play a role in knowing that a lot of people futures are in a much better situation because you exist. So I think you can look back, and we're going to talk about fees. We're going to talk about some of the negatives, but like overall, the 401k has been a positive thing. And now, and when I say this, people are like, Caleb, you've been critical on the 401k. Well, I think when you talk about high income earners, you talk about entrepreneurs, you talk about investors, some of the same reasons why a 401k is so amazing, the restrictions, are some of the reasons why I've been critical for it. But really, most people, if they had control and access to their money, they would bankrupt themselves. So I have to take a step back and say each person's in a different place. And the 401k overall has done so much more good than it's been bad. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
Oh, no, no question. My youngest son said, "Hey, when you get interviewed by financial writers, that think 401k should be killed off, because of its fact, hey, it's certainly not perfect by any means. Uh, he said, well, why don't you ask him, where do you think we would be today if Ronald Reagan's effort to kill it had succeeded, back in 84? Uh,
Yeah.
and that's key. And tying off that point, Caleb, most employees who are covered by these plans were never covered and would never have been covered by pension plans. Over 90% of the 401ks, the plans that are in existence cover businesses with less than 100 employees. Very few of those um, businesses had or ever would have had pension plans. So it gets mislabeled in that regard. And there's one other issue here I've mentioned in the book too, and that is the fact, hey, I know pensions. I was in the actuarial process. I know how they function. One systematic deficiency of pensions, whether it's Social Security, state, local government, or private employers, is they have been legally permitted forever to promise benefits that are never properly funded. And so participants in most of these plans are unaware of the fact that they have as much investment risk as they do in a 401k. They just don't know it.
And it's like the whole risk. It's like yeah, you have a pension plan, but it's only as good as the ability to pay.
Absolutely.
Your book is called 401k 40 years later, and as you look back, I think the best summary as I read through it is, wow, I am like, it is so humbling that God gave you this platform and discovery, and so many people have saved. But then you've also, looked at kind of the nasty stuff that's happened in the Wall Street industry. And I've interviewed Barry Dykes on my podcast, and he talks a lot about the corruption. You talk so much about fees. So I want you to dive into what happened to the industry once you discovered this, because wouldn't it have been amazing if you would have gotten paid a little bit for all the people that have profited on the 401k. Yeah, I think you mentioned in an interview back in the day, if you had a quarter for every time someone you got impacted by a 401k, and you've actually had people that found your address and sent you a quarter. So why don't you talk about the negative side, especially as it relates to fees? And because that is definitely a huge theme. And quite frankly, you have a business right now that addresses that same concept. And if I could summarize one thing, you are very, very passionate about low cost way of investing, and fees are a huge negative thing as it relates to a 401k.
Yeah, and kind of give a broad perspective for a moment and then get more specific is, back in the early days of 401k, there were only two investment options, and participants can split their money in 25% multiples. So they took about a minute for me to tell participants what their investment alternatives were. Okay. It was that simple. 0, 75, 50, 50, 25, 75. And at that point, the mutual fund was a mom and pop business. They were very small, not that many of them. And including Vanguard, Fidelity, they were small. So the first major point here is 401k has turned the mutual fund industry into what it is today. No question about it. Second is the fact that Wall Street and investment advisors were nowhere involved in this. What happened, it probably, took about 10 years for things to begin to shift. And, first step was for the mutual fund companies to realize, hey, there's real money in this, big money. And so what happened, the first step that was troubling was we got into what were called bundled structures. Under the original operating structure 401ks, the employer paid the administrative fees, the participants only paid investment fees. And typically the investment fees were low, particularly in the big companies because they leveraged off their pension assets, and how they structured the fees that were paid. So one of the early books that I wrote, I interviewed HR directors for major companies, and I think I mentioned one of them in the book. I won't do it here, but one of the big time Fortune 500 companies I interviewed explained, the HR director explained how he moved their plan to Fidelity when, Fidelity came out with a bundled structure and it eliminated $100,000 a year off his HR budget when he was being pushed to reduce fees. Um, and, I talked to Fidelity back in that era and I said, look, your current fee structure is designed, for retail buyers who are putting $10,000, into your mutual funds. You're getting hundreds of millions of dollars here. There obviously should be a different fee structure. And I was told, well, we can't do that. We have to have the same structure. Separate point on that. Now, if you go to American funds, you'll find they offer 10 to 15 different fee structures. So they've gotten far away from that. So that was the first problem, was bundling became a way for companies to dump their administrative expenses onto
And
the participant.
can I clarify that for a second? So early on, people would pay like an administrative fee to someone like you. And then the investments, there wouldn't be a high, like the basis points would maybe be 20, like 20, 20 basis points for the investment fee. But what happened is these companies would say, wait, we want to save some money. So we're not going to pay like the administrative fee to people like you. We're just going to essentially pass that on to the employee. And so instead of 20 points, it's now they're upward to 1, 2, and you even mentioned in your book 3% on some of these plans. Is that a good, like, they're transferring the cost?
Well, getting to the higher level is another story, but this was the first step. The first step was to move, to 10, 20, maybe, basis points up to typically 100 or so.
Yeah.
So then, we, the next major step involved investment advice. And this is probably one of my regrets, is that I helped launch investment advice. And, the reason I did that was the guy who was pioneering that business was, his plan was to do it via the internet, for, $10, $15 a year per employee, which certainly was quite reasonable to provide, real hands-on help to participants. At the time, it was widely held that it was illegal to provide investment advice to participants, and that wasn't true. It was an incorrect perception. So I was able to get Department of Labor to issue, a pronouncement saying, hey, not only would we like, it's illegal, but we would like participants to get investment advice if it's done properly. So at the time, I was helping, that business that, launched the online advice, to market that, to get employers to embrace it. And, we met with, in order to do that, we had to get a buy-in from the major providers like Fidelity and Vanguard and so forth. And, they resisted it terribly. I met with one of the major providers at that time, the head of it, and said, look, you should make this available to your, your clientele. And his response was, there's no way in the world we're going to have an independent firm advising how they should invest because it'll affect my bottom line, our fees. So terrible, major resistance. So what happened over time is that shifted, but what really changed it was all of a sudden the investment community realized, hey, wait a minute, rather than losing money, we can make more money. And the way we can make more money is by providing advice and adding another layer of fees. So that's what they did. So they added another 1% or so of fee on top. And I was speaking to a group of advisors, an event when this was happening, when one of the major insurance companies was explaining to them, hey, here's a way you can get paid another 25 basis points by selling our advice product. So that's how we got then to two to, up into the 3% range.
Yeah, that's fascinating about how you had a good intention. What was interesting is, when did Empower start? Because I was so crazy because you were part of the company, or at least advising them, and they were an internet solution to give advice. When did that company start? Because obviously when I read that, I'm like, I very much resonated with our heart with BetterWealth is, use the internet to help people. When did they start that company?
Well, I got involved with them in 97. Would have been, you know, maybe 96 or something like that, they were starting to put it together.
And was it I mean, that was very innovative at the time, and I know that it didn't really work out. Was the reason it didn't work out, was there just people that pushed back because they didn't want there to be a conflict of interest of, like, you ultimately giving advice and then hurting the investment people's bottom line?
No, actually, it didn't work, Caleb, because the CEO of Empower didn't listen to me.
All right.
The way they made it available was that employers paid a fee, to make it available to the participants, and then Empower put major effort into trying to get them, participants to use it. Well, the problem was Empower got paid for every participant, but they couldn't drive up the participant rates above 10 to 20%. So what happened, employers began to say, hey, wait a minute. I mean, it's great, but, the people that are using it are typically the ones who are smarter anyhow. We're really not getting to the ones who really need the advice. And, didn't really work. The way they should have launched it, which is what I was recommending, was to make it available to everybody, and you had to default out of it.
Okay.
So you would automatically be given the advice and had to elect not to do it. And by the way, uh, you didn't have to implement the advice on your own; it would be implemented for you, which gets off down the road here. We can back to is how I got into discussion of why I would blow up 401k investment structure and start over. It ties into all of this.
And obviously you've been taken out of context by saying, like, when people take that as a headline, they're like, oh, the father of the 401k regrets the 401k and all this stuff. And what you're simply saying is, the fees and how, like, are outrageous. And if you could do that over again, you would change how the fees worked in these plans.
Yeah, it's an investment structure,
Yep.
Caleb, and had interestingly, at Empower launched this the way I was recommending, we wouldn't have seen target maturity fund or target date funds get where they are today.
Yep.
That was, they came right behind, and I won't get off into that, but when I was interviewed and you say about being taken out of context, I did that interview and talked, made the comment about I would blow it up. I was talking about the investment structure. Either the writer didn't understand or, creatively flipped it. In any event, he got a big uptick on it. So it worked out to his benefit.
That's how I knew who you were, is in my research. A lot of people definitely use that as a tagline. And they're pushing an agenda, and it's usually an anti 401k agenda so that they could make more money on something else. So it's crazy how the world
Yeah.
works.
Yeah. And interestingly, I mean, I got upset by it, Caleb, but then I realized, I don't control this stuff, and realized, Well, it put me back more in the news than what it would have otherwise. That's the positive side
We'll
of it.
we'll call it the Trump effect. All right. It's interesting in your book. You talk a lot about target date funds or target maturity funds, and it's interesting because I've always heard negative things about them, but you wrote in such a way that actually, if done well, it would avoid a lot of the unnecessary fees. So if you did that with a Vanguard low index fund, you could then take someone who majority of people are not educated and they're not going to spend the time being educated. And so it's one of those things where they could be properly balanced with their portfolio. And we won't get into that in this interview, but that they could be properly balanced with a low cost. But then you also said in your book at the end that you aren't in that nearing retirement because there's different rules when you're retiring. You want to obviously look for income cash flow. Can you explain a little bit about what your thoughts are with target date funds or target maturity funds?
Yeah, and this will get in. I want to talk about another situation I'm working on right now. Ties into this a bit. The problem is that the way 401ks are structured today is that each plan has most plans. Have an investment advisor that helps the employer pick a menu of funds and gets paid to do that. And when I get those portfolios that are picked, Caleb, they're pretty much the same. Okay. But these guys get paid as if they're rebuilding the Taj Mahal each time.
Yeah.
And all there are is canned solutions. And the same thing happens with investment advice. And this applies to IRAs. Advisors are selling, and this is what Empower is trying to sell, was the fact that, hey, look, you give us our data, we'll crunch it through our system, and we'll come back with your specific recommendation. Well, all of these structures, all that happens, Caleb, is, and you know this, there are 8 to maybe 12 portfolios. There aren't individual portfolios for each person. There are 8 to 12 canned portfolios that individuals are being pushed into. And so the structure, today, from what exists today, and I've done this, I did it with about $100 million plan where we took the plan, blew it up, eliminated the investments they had, moved it to Vanguard, put everybody in these target maturity date funds, but then also opened a full brokerage window, mutual fund window, for those that wanted to continue to manage it on their own. And when you do that, about 90% of the participants, stay in the target maturity funds. And the positives of that is they become less anxious about their investments. When they understand it, that, hey, look, you leave it, you forget it, you let it go, they stop getting traumatized by the ups and downs and those discussions around the water tank and over lunch, etc., go away. And so what happens? The biggest mistake that people make are moving their money at the wrong time, as you well know. So those who tend to be running on their own, typically end up looking at what's really hot. That's where they place their money, which is usually in the next cycle what's going to be in the bottom. They're moving out, or they panic and sell out when the market's at 8,000 and buy back in when it's 20,000.
Yeah. Welcome to America, ladies and gentlemen. So, yes, anything else you want to put? I have quite a few more questions that I want to delve into, and it's crazy how time flies.
Well, I'm okay. I have a couple stories I'd like to get into that are specific examples, but
yes, and I want to go into the stories. I have one question that I want to talk to you about because I want to get your thoughts on it. So, like when ERISA came in and they very much crippled the pension plan, industry, and you look at our government, and you look at, we're in an interesting election time right now. And here's my, if I take a step back, you obviously have written this in your book that the 401k, it was never designed to be the sole retirement plan. It was never designed to be that for most people. my big concern is I just look at where our country's going, and I wonder if it's like from a philosophical point of view, is a lot of people are putting their money in a plan that's participating in the government and that can be changed or restricted or taken away. And I don't want to get super extreme, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way. I just wonder, like, is that a concern that we should have? Should we be hedging? Should all of our money be going into a government sponsored plan that potentially the biggest risk might not be the investment risk or might not even be the fees? It could be a politician, you know, trying to figure out what we're going to do with our unfunded liabilities and get creative. Have you thought about that? Have you been asked that before? And that's obviously just something I think about.
Um, we have a big issue, obviously. Yeah, we got a runaway train wreck in Washington. You know, no fiscal responsibility anywhere. Some point it's got to hit the wall, and when it happens, who knows? Where can you be safe? I don't have the answer to that. I mean, can they take over 401k? Well, yeah, probably could. Can they take over my personal bank account? Yeah, how about my real estate? And other assets. I mean, yeah, we don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
So I guess my input generally to people in that regard is the only real planning you can do is based on historically things kind of operating as they have in the past, but also tying into the kind of things you do. Clearly, you need to most people need to do more than 401k.
Yeah.
So for sure, they need to look at things like you do and other types of investments. I mean,
Okay.
I've done that personally, and you got to do that.
Sometime I'm going to have you back on the show. We'll talk about bank-owned life insurance and COLI and pension plans, because I know that you can go down the rabbit hole with that. One thing I want to now go into are the 3 case studies, because the big call to action here is I want to drive people to the work that you're doing. If you're a business owner and you're listening to this right now, take action, because the work that you're doing is very much shedding light on how people can pay less in fees and create a plan that's really a win-win. And I know that you have a couple stories with that, and I really want this to be helpful for the listener, and I want to help you get your message out.
Oh, thank you, Caleb. Yeah, there are 3 of them I want to run through, and I've worked on this, the last 3 years or so, and what I've been focusing on is, the small business group, generally where we have business owners earning under $100,000, solo entrepreneurs, family type businesses, etc. And so I started on this and came up originally with 4 different designs that are ways to pretty much duplicate the benefits of a 401k, but without any fees, setup or administrative fees, and without all the complexity you have with a 401k. And those programs can, they can be the assets can be invested as little as 0.08%. I mean, that's been amazing. And as I did that, I came up actually with some creative ways of being able to take payroll deduction IRA as one example and work into it an employer contribution. It was matching contribution. It was kind of what happened with 401k. There are a couple of different designs I came up with of IRA-based payroll deduction 401ks with a matching employer contribution.
And so what is the difference between that and a 401k? Because it almost sounds identical.
Well, the difference is, man, you don't have the complexity. You have none of the compliance issues to deal with.
Oh, yay.
With a family-owned business, small business, I don't want to get too deep here, but you have 2 big things to contend with a 401k. It's top heavy and non-discrimination. So as a result of those, for most family-owned business, you need to make a 3% of pay employer contribution for 401k to work. Well, hey, many small employers, can't afford to, don't want to make a 3% employer contribution. So that's one issue. The other one is you have the fees, the setup and the operating fees. And the next is some liability exposure. And so I'll get into a story. As I was working on this, I got approached by a local business here that had a 401k. And they asked if I would look at it. And I said, sure. And so when I got the details, it's a 7-employee business. They had about 800,000 in their plan. And employer is paying over $1,500 a year in fees. Participants were paying 2.75%. So the designs I came up with here, I put in the model guide. So I gave them, I said, Model 3, you should replace the 401k with Model 3. They did that. They eliminated all employer fees. They eliminated, they reduced the cost for employees to, the 2.75 down to 0.14%. Gigantic difference, okay? So that's the first story. The next one, involves the state mandates. Oregon is the spearheader of this. They're out in the forefront offering a program called Oregon Saves. So I launched an effort to compete with Oregon Saves last fall. And the reason I did that, Caleb, is the Oregon Saves program is limited to Roth IRA only, which is after tax, very limited investment options, but it costs 1%. And so again, these alternatives that that we make available provide more other tax alternatives, not just the the Roth, but the traditional Roth. So you can do either wide open investment alternatives, and investments for as low as 0.8%. So that's another example, and so we've helped some small employers that have checked this out take advantage of that. And then the last story is one that I'm in right now. This is a Pennsylvania solo entrepreneur, and she has worked really hard, have a successful business. She makes about $65K from it, and she's putting her advisor set her up in a solo K. She's putting 16,000 into Roth and 16.5 into the solo K. She's done a great job. Fantastic. When I initially got her information, I said, hey, wait, great. This is what you should be doing. And then I started to peel the layers off and dig underneath it. Found out it had been set up the way it was been structured. She's losing almost $3,000 in tax benefits that she could be getting annually that she's not getting. And then I said, well, tell me about the investing. And she gave me investing information, found out she's paying 1.89% for investing when she could be doing it for 0.14, and getting same type of investments. I mean, it aggravates me. I mean, it really aggravates me to see that happening.
So a couple clarifying questions. So number one, it sounds like you are you're not a huge fan of the Roth. Am I picking up on that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I've written a paper called Roth or Not to Roth. You have a lot of things to take into consideration, whether you should do it or not without, getting bogged down on it.
Well, and I just look at
what bugs me on it, Caleb, is all the people, without getting into names, including one of the most famous known one, who says everybody should have a Roth. That's what you should do. And they ask one question: do you expect tax rates to be higher or lower in the future? And and based on that fact, well, you ought to do a Roth. And there are a lot of other things should be considered.
And I know who you're talking about, and it is interesting because I look at the future and I go, yes, you can get a tax benefit today, but if taxes are higher, there's no benefit there. And so that's the one thing that it's just, I wonder for some people, like when the 401k was started, the taxes, like you said, a top tax was over 70%. So deferring was a very, very smart move. Now, I think it's an interesting, and I definitely, if you're listening to this, you want to talk to someone who can look at the full picture. So I guess that was my question. The other question I have is these 401k alternatives. What are the contribution limits if you're dealing with the IRA? Are they less, or can you, in some cases, contribute more than what you can in a 401k?
Well, the first two models are limited to the IRA personal limits, and for many small businesses that works for them.
Yeah.
It's an easy way. Set up a plan that will mirror and look like a 401k. The third one is as much as 25% of compensation. So if you're making 100,000, that's 25,000 bucks a year.
Which is more than what you can put into a 401k.
Yeah, sure.
Wow. Wow.
And
Okay.
then the last one, I forget dollar wise, it gets up into 20-some $1,000,
Okay.
plus a 3% employer match.
Okay. Okay.
So again, these are viable alternatives for most businesses where the owner is earning less than 100,000.
Yeah.
They're not the answer for attorneys, doctors, it's so forth that are making 200,000-300,000.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Amazing. I thank you so much for coming on and not only sharing the history, but just being willing to share your wisdom. I mean, it's so funny as you're naming out all these dates. I wasn't even a thought. Like, yeah, so I'm grateful to be talking to someone who is like hitting the streets and actively advocating on my behalf and others before I was even born. So thank you for that. Any final thoughts you have on the 401k? I want to ask you two questions before we wrap up. They have
No,
nothing. They
I
have no
just
401k
wonder.
related. They're not 401k related.
I just wonder how many people be willing to sit through this long of an interview. It's got to be pretty boring.
Oh, I assure you, we have some people that love to know the details, and this is what I'm going to preface this whole interview with is this is not for the person that wants a soundbite. We can do that, but this will be a very good for someone that really wants to dive in. So the last two questions that I have is number one, been married over 60 years. What is your 2 cents on having a happy marriage?
Well, there are two. The first one is the fact that despite our age, Caleb, we didn't engage in this as an experiment. We both committed to the fact that, hey, this is permanent. That was number one, which was certainly important. And hey, look, I mean, shoot, we know marriages go through difficulties, and we had 4 kids. Actually, well, God bless. Fortunately, his design more than ours. We were married for a few years before the first one came, but then they came fast, and we had 4, and I think it was 50 months. And fortunately, it stopped, and that was a challenge. Fortunately, Debbie was the oldest. The 3 boys were type A, aggressive, athletic, extremely competitive, and life was very interesting. And when they were in their teams, and I used to speak for Christian businessmen, I said I wasn't sure whether they would live to adulthood or I would, but fortunately we made it, and they're all doing well and have 9 grandchildren that are doing okay. But the second key that was very important was when I was 28 years old, I came to a saving faith by accepting Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And, that changed the direction of my life, dramatically. And if that hadn't happened, it's highly unlikely our marriage would have survived.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think a lot of people get into things and they have the attitude, we'll see what happens. And it's powerful, those two things that you shared. So thank you for that. My last question that I ask all of the people that I have the opportunity to interview is what I call the legacy question. And the legacy question essentially goes like this. Say this is your last day on earth and you're with the people that you love the most, your kids, your wife, and anyone else that you consider close family. What are you going to pass on through what you've learned? You can't give them any money. You can't give them any tangible things. You can give them one last conversation. What are you going to make sure to communicate in that conversation?
Well, obviously, the top of the list is, the faith issue, clearly. And, but probably the next one, that I have told them and I tell other young people is whatever you choose to do, there are going to be things you don't like about it. It doesn't matter, but your success is probably going to be determined most by how well you tackle the things you don't like about, your job, even if you have your own business, then the things that you do like. That's one piece of advice I readily give. And then probably the next one be the fact that the most important thing isn't how much you make, but it's how you deal with what you do make. And you have spenders and savers, and I have certainly found over the years, and I have it true in my own family, that the savers, even though they may make less money, have money available and they have assets. The spenders don't. The problem with the spenders, to them, the issue is I just need more money, and they unfortunately get them, more money, and it gets spent. So, when you're starting out young, and I've just have recommended this to one of my granddaughters, is the importance of having a budget. And, I suggested to her one that's available online, to be able to tap in and to utilize. And I said, hey, look, you got to do that and learn how, and the sooner the better.
Love it. Ted, thank you so much for coming on. How can people find out the work that you're doing, support what you're doing, get your book? I know you can get this on Amazon, and I will have all the links below. But what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Website's www.benna401k.com.
Yep. So go to www.benna401k.com or go on to Amazon. What?
Well, I'm going to say that'll do it.
Yep. And or you can go on to Amazon, type your name in, or look for 401k 40 years later. It's a phenomenal read. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing what the future holds. I've learned a ton by being here. You got my mind racing, and I can't wait to actually learn your genius, because I want to continue your work on and help people pay less in fees and help people become savers. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to the BetterWealth podcast. It would mean the world to me if you could hit subscribe, leave a review, and share this with the people that you know and love.